Hi, I'm Amanda.
And I'm Darcy.
And welcome back to CoRe Reads. Today we're talking about part 2, The Advisor of Deepak Malhotra's The Peacemaker's Code. So, I don't know, I'm really enjoying the book. We're getting into it now. The stopping to come and record things is actually a little frustrating. Because it's so fast-paced that I just want to keep reading.
Yeah, and we have to remind each other, okay, no, you have to stop. After when you get to the next part, you just stop.
Well, I've taken to rubber banding the pages that I'm not allowed to read together.
That's clever.
So you can't just keep going. So I am really enjoying the book, and we'll chat a little bit more about some of the things that are coming up for us. And if you're finding things are coming up that we've forgotten, or you want to chime in on something we've chatted about, we're on Twitter at CoRe Clinic, or our hashtag is CoRe Reads. So
let's get into it. All right, so I have my little notes. I'm going to pull them out so that I can make sure I talk about all the stuff that's exciting, because this new chapter, or not chapter, I guess part, is a little richer. We get a little bit more of a little bit more character stuff, a little bit more of a change of format, and I'm kind of excited by it. I know you are too.
I'm really enjoying the shift in tone. So we're going from really like watching one character to some backstories, some motivational stories, learning more about all of the different players, and a little bit more about what's happening. And I'm really enjoying the kind of the use of story, and then this nice little technique of having like the history little chapters from the main character's book inserted in. And they're in a very different language, right? That not only is it like a much more kind of dry academic, and luckily they're really short. They're really short, but it's a nice way of kind of peppering it through. And, you know, it's that sort of meta moment of talking about, like, we're reading a story, they're telling us stories, and then this discussion about, like, what is the value of story in decision making?
Well, what is the value and what are the pitfalls? Because one of the big things I see is this this reminder of, like, the risks of using analogy and the risks of assuming that the past dictates the future in different ways. So the book talks a lot about, you know, okay, well, how are we making that decision? Because if we base it off of this analogy, we should do this. And if we base it off this other analogy, we should do this completely opposite thing. And if we kind of throw those both out, what are we thinking? What has longevity? How do we make decisions?
Right, this real, like, how do these stories inform us? And you see a little bit, and I'm actually kind of curious for some of the kind of speakers using analogy, if it's actually a little bit of, like, it's an attempt to motivate, but also a little bit of psychological safety. It's not me that's telling you that this is the right move. It's this historical thing that I've drawn this line from that's telling us that this is the right decision. And so it's like, it's not quite as big a risk for me. I'm not saying this is the way to go. I'm saying, look, all of this history tells us this is obviously the right thing to do. And so you're sort of seeing characters make really strong pronouncements using stories from the past at the same time as we have these little history blurbs telling us that people don't always draw the right conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's been very interesting. And I'll just say that format switch too, that, like, here's one page of sort of dry text, almost makes the fast-paced conversational bit feel faster. So I have also just as a reader enjoyed the way that plays with pacing in, like, a totally interesting way.
Yeah, and I like it's like, you know, pre-wiring us to think through some of the pieces that are going to be really fascinating, and I'm looking for different things. They talk about analogy, and then when your guys are giving different speeches, I'm looking for different things, and I'm actually really enjoying that element.
Yeah, I think so too, and I'm excited for what it sets us up for kind of the rest of the book. I'm sort of hoping that these would stay, that we'll kind of keep getting these little, like, history book things, just because I do think you're exactly right. It leads you into the scene in a different way, as well as just making things a little more dynamic.
If we don't, I'm curious what it says then, right? Like, if these kinds of history pieces are useful at certain points in how we're thinking, because, like, you know, right now it's about advising. you know, and the next part, which we won't talk about yet because we haven't read it, is about strategy, right? And so it's like, at what point will this kind of looking backwards at history still be useful?
Excellent.
Right? And then there's something else that's been coming up in the story for me, and I'm not actually sure we chatted about this earlier, and that's this idea about like power and use of force, and how do you display power, and how displays of power are used to make people feel safe. Or often, well, in mediation, I find often they're used when people feel really insecure, right? And so often the people that are championing shows of force are the people that feel the most insecure. And that real kind of discussion about, you know, what is it to show power? What happens if your show of power is misinterpreted as aggression? Again, and where are those lines, especially cross-culturally? I mean, this is like human alien, but even like, you know, in my family, like Russian British, right? Like,
right.
You know, these spaces of like what's one person's show of aggression is another person, you know, being strong and kind of owning power. And so I found that discussion really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. All right, there is something I want to talk about, but I want to be really careful not to get spoilery, which is that we've had sort of an introduction to something weird happening. And I know we've said aliens, but there's some time stuff.
She said weird, and I wasn't sure whether it was time or romance.
Completely true. Let's go to the romance after, but because I know we feel the same way about that. But I thought the time thing was interesting, and I'm curious how that connects to some of the conversation we were just having about things like pacing and force and all. Like, I don't understand time anything, and we've been told at least it's not time travel.
At the end of the first part, they said it's not time travel, and I actually really appreciated that, because when I see time used as a mechanism, it's often like a way out, right? Or it's going into a kind of an exploration that, like, me as the child of a physicist
Yes.
has a lot of problem with, because they get the physics wrong. Or they take it somewhere that just doesn't make any sense for it to go. And I find that I spend a lot of time suspending my disbelief actively. And in this case, it's not time travel kind of allows some speculation there. And then I'm thinking, like, are we going into quantum worlds theory or some other kind of piece that, like, actually could be really interesting, because that speculative exploration is really interesting.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to get really curious about how that mechanism will be used, and fingers crossed, it'll be good.
I mean, I'm starting to get excited as like different scenes are labeled with like day 15. This is happening on day 7. Like, okay, let's see what that means later on when we learn a little more about time.
Absolutely. And one of the things I appreciated in this chapter is we get an explanation of why the alien is in the U.S.
Yes.
Which rarely ever happens in American-centric sci-fi, and I actually really appreciate that little bit of a backstory, and I think it sets us up for some really interesting possible future conflict.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. All right, but you mentioned the romance thing, so we have to get at this, because that is something that you and I are both generally nervous about.
I had a big cringe, because often for me reading, the like doesn't quite fit super stereotypical, like, airhead that is like an accessory of the main character, weird romance stuff.
Yeah.
Just gets in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
And hopefully this doesn't follow that pattern.
Well, and I think it's worth noting that we already have some clues that it's like not quite, right? The love interest of the main character is not an airhead, and seems to have a reason to be there.
Yes, and seems, you know, like, so, and seems to like have like this deep respect for, you know, so it's not just like, oh, they're hot.
There's a little, oh, there's hot.
Right? But it's also interesting because, like, at this point in the pandemic, looking at kind of what I have seen people that I know and care about do in relationships have either dramatically accelerated or fallen apart. Right?
Yes.
Like that has been something that I've been watching, and so what might have seemed like really improbable and just a kind of literary technique to motivate something we don't know about yet, actually seems a little bit more probable from this point in a COVID pandemic.
I agree with you there. And so I'll be crossing my fingers that the relationship kind of stays in that zone of like bonding over crisis and both having a reason to be in existence. And we'll see, because women in science fiction is always, and women in action, and this really has a lot of action. We'll see. We'll just see what happens.
I have a lot of hope.
That's all.
I have a lot of hope, right? And and we've seen signals that this isn't like a brotastic classic set of tropes for sci-fi, and so, I'm really hoping that that a few of the threads that I would like come through, or that I'm surprised in a way that's interesting, because I'm okay with that too.
Yes, actually, that's an excellent point. I hope to be surprised. I always hope to be surprised.
Okay, so anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap it up?
No, let's wrap it up.
Okay, so next time we'll be doing The Strategist, which is part 3. And if you are around in September and you have enjoyed the book as much as we are enjoying it so far, do come online with us September 13th Pacific time, noon to 1:30, and we'll be chatting about our insights.
It's going to be a good time.